At Joshua chapter 7 this Lord's Day, both this morning and this evening in our studies. You want to be turning over there. We're not going to read the whole chapter, but we are going to look at some verses, or at least, I guess, one verse in that chapter, and then some of the other verses that we're going to tie in and look at this morning will surround or be very close to that chapter itself. We're studying a series of lessons that's kind of designed to go through the Bible, and thus far in our studies, or at least what we've studied the last couple of weeks, is some of the highs that the children of Israel experienced as they were getting ready to enter into the Promised Land and as they conquered some of the cities, the first city there within Canaan itself. And so just think about the mindset of the children of Israel as they have experienced this high of conquering the city of Jericho. What might have been going through their minds, and what were some of the emotions that they might have been experiencing? Well, I think joy, happiness, rejoicing, and confidence would be all of those things that would have been embellished within the mind of the children of Israel. You know, they had seen the walls of Jericho, which was probably the strongest, the most fortified, maybe I should put it that way, the most fortified city in the land of Canaan. They had literally seen those walls crumble before them. And so when you were thinking about the future, what does the future for Israel look like? Well, it had to look bright. It had to seem, at least in their minds, that there was nothing and there was no one who could stop them from conquering the Promised Land. But what we read about here in chapter 7 is the second conquest, the second city that is attacked in the Promised Land, or the land of Canaan. And when Israel launches that army to attack this city, they are soundly defeated. They are in fact routed. The Bible tells us that at least 36 soldiers lose their life in that battle, and the city of Ai is to easily run the children of Israel back from where they came. What I want us to think about this morning, now remember the last couple of weeks, if you've been with us, the theme for our lessons has been victory. And so this week, we have a little bit different theme. We want to talk about the idea of defeat, because the Bible records for us not only the victories that God's people won in the Promised Land, but also a lot of the defeats that they experienced too. And while it's important that we understand what were the factors that led them to be victorious over their enemies and to ultimately conquer this land, it's also important for us to understand what caused them defeat in numerous instances throughout the Bible. I want you to look with me here in verse 1 in Joshua chapter 7. It says, "But the children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed thing. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel." We're introduced to a man by the name of Achan in this verse. And if you have a little bit of context, if you've read a little bit in this chapter, we have an indication of what the meaning of his name actually is. In fact, if you were to sit down and open a Bible encyclopedia or open a Bible dictionary and look up the name Achan, it would tell you that literally translated, his name means trouble. If you go down to verse 25 in this same chapter, that's the very question that Joshua asked him. He says, who is this, or why are you the one who is troubling Israel? In fact, we learned that the place where Achan ended up dying was actually named the Valley of Trouble. And so we're introduced to this man, and what we're introduced to by the idea of his name is that he's an individual who's very troubled. One of the underlying lessons that I get, this isn't really part of the main lesson today, but one of the underlying lessons that I get from reading this chapter is just how much damage one individual can cause among God's people. You know, you read about this one man being the cause of all this trouble, of all the things that happened to God's people. 36 people literally died. 36 soldiers died because of one man. And when you look at some of the battles that Israel fights and the numbers in the Bible, you might think, well, that's not very much compared to all these other battles. But hey, if that was me, I would think that's pretty tragic, wouldn't you? Or if it was one of your family members, you would probably think it was a very troubling event.
And so we have an underlying lesson here of how much damage one person can cause among God's people. But you also have the opposite of that is true too. How much good one person can do among the people of God. That's not what I really want to focus upon, but what I do want to talk about is the Bible says, it indicates to us in verse 1 that Achan committed a trespass. And if you go back to chapter 6, we studied it last week as we studied the conquest of the city of Jericho. Here's what happened, or here's what Achan did that was a trespass. In Joshua chapter 6, back up to that chapter, and beginning in verse 17, these were God's orders that he had given to the children of Israel concerning the city of Jericho. He said, "The city shall be accursed, even in and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed, when ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord." Achan, being a soldier within the army of Israel, undoubtedly had to hear these commandments that were given to him by Joshua. And what God had told the children of Israel concerning the city of Jericho is that everything in it was supposed to be destroyed. Now, all the people, all the animals, all the possessions, except for the gold and the silver and the brass and the iron, those things were to be brought into and deposited into the treasury of the Lord. But everything else and everyone else in that city was supposed to be destroyed. And God even warned the children of Israel. He said, you got to be careful as you're going in that city, because if you take of some of these things that I've deemed as being cursed and you're supposed to destroy, then that's going to lead you to being cursed in my eyes, and that's going to lead the entire nation and the entire army of Israel of being cursed in my eyes too. You have this principle, and somebody might ask the question, why did God do this? And I think one of the answers that we find within the pages of the Bible, God always demands the first of everything. And so this is the first city that's being conquered in this promised land. It belongs to God. Everyone and everything in it. The people weren't supposed to take of anything in it for themselves. And so Achan had to have heard those orders, those divine commandments from God. Yet he intentionally, knowing full well what he was doing, he intentionally disobeyed these commandments of God. You know, if you go down to verse 20 here in Joshua chapter 7, we might ask the question, what led him to committing sin and ultimately to being defeated and the children of God being defeated? And we're not left to wonder what caused him to sin and what caused him to be defeated. In fact, in verse 20, Achan says to Joshua, he says, "Indeed, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel." We're in chapter 7 here. "And thus, this is the King James Version, and thus have I done." In other words, this is what Achan is saying, and this is why I did this. So we have in Achan's own words why he committed this sin, and why he took of these accursed things, and why he was defeated, and why the children of Israel were defeated. And so that's how I want us to think about it in this study today. We are going to look at it, what caused Achan to sin and ultimately led to his defeat and the children of Israel's defeat, and what can we learn from that today? Well, it all is taken this morning from verse 21. That's really the focus of our study. So if you want to look at verse 21 with me, here's what we're going to start with. Part of what led to Achan committing sin and being defeated is he took a second look. Now, I'm taking a little bit of liberty here because the Bible doesn't actually say that he looked at these things twice. But I want you to think about just naturally how this thing would have taken place in the life of Achan. In verse 21, he says this. He says, "When I saw the spoils of a goodly Babylonian garment, and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight." I've said before, but you can imagine, imagine being an army in this, or being a soldier in this army, and you're marching into this city, and you're fighting a battle. I don't think when Achan entered into that city, he was like, now where are all the Babylonian garments? Where is all the silver and the gold going to be? I think he was entering that city saying, we got to destroy everyone and everything. And he would have had to been focused and locked in so he himself wouldn't have gotten injured. But somewhere along the way, Achan comes across this good-looking Babylonian robe. He also sees within probably somebody's house, man, that's a lot of gold and that's a lot of silver. And I imagine he kind of glimpsed at it and he's fighting the battle, but probably in the midst of that battle, he goes, hey, that's still a pretty good looking garment over there. That's a lot of gold and that's a lot of silver for one person to have under one roof. And he begins thinking about, what it would be like to have these things in his own possession. And he probably couldn't help but see them the first time. But undoubtedly, what I always say about this principle is we may not be able to avoid the first glance of seeing something, but we can avoid the second look, can't we? The second look is always a conscious effort to bring something back to mind or to think about something further. And, the Bible has a lot to say about the second look. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, one of what I would deem one of the wisest books that you'll find within the Bible, Solomon wrote about in Proverbs 4 and verses 20 through 25. He begins in verse 20. He says, my son, attend unto my words, incline thine ears unto my saying. And what he says in these verses, he gives advice for how you keep your heart and your mind in check. He gives advice for how to control your mouth and your lips. But then in verse 25, he gives advice for our eyes. And here's what he says. He says, listen to what I'm telling to you. Incline your ears to wisdom. Let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. The first glance is often the most innocent one. The first of seeing something is often the one that you really don't think a whole lot about it, and you didn't really intend to dwell on those things. But the second is what gets the imagination going. And it's what gets the plans getting put into order. And it ultimately can lead us down the road that leads us to commit sin. And so here's Solomon's words of wisdom. He says, keep your eyes focused. Keep your eyes where they need to go. Don't be looking around. I can remember in elementary school, sometimes we would go places and we would always have a line. And the teacher would be at the front of the line. She'd always be doing, look up here, eyes up front. You got to stay focused, don't you? Because as a kid, if you start looking around, you start thinking about things over there, and you're not paying attention where your class is going, and you start talking to your buddies. You got to keep your eyes straight ahead. And that's what the Bible is telling us here. We got to keep our eyes focused on the right thing. We got to keep our eyes focused on God's Word. Don't be looking in the wrong direction. Don't be looking at things we shouldn't be looking at. And often as Christians, when you think about why are we defeated, what leads us to commit sin, isn't it often that second look? It's not the first one, but it's the second one that you can control, and you look back on something, and then your imagination starts churning, and then your plans start going into effect. And so Achan said, I looked at these things, and that's what caused me to take them. The second thing that I want us to think about that caused the defeat of Israel and caused Achan to sin is he tried to redefine terms that God had already clearly defined for them. Notice what he calls these things in verse 21. He said, when I saw the spoils, a goodly Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight. He calls them, he says, these are spoils. Now I want you to think about that word because that's very important. It tells me how Achan was looking at and how he was viewing this garment and the gold and the silver that he eventually took. The word spoils, and as it's used here, just simply means an advantage or a prosperity that has been brought to somebody because of their actions or their positions. And usually in war, it meant this: since you were the soldier, part of the army who was going in and conquering these people, that meant whatever they had now belongs to you. Because of your position, because of your actions, all of these things now come into your possession. We read about in the Bible how that was a common practice of that day and age. When an army would go in to conquer a city, they would take all the spoils, everything that was left over, and they would put it in a pile and they would divide it up amongst themselves. And so what did Achan see whenever he saw this garment and when he saw the gold and the silver? He saw spoils. He saw something that rightfully belonged to him because of his actions or because of his condition. He saw things that were physically prosperous to him that would help him out because of what he had done. You see, the problem is this: when God talked about these things, He didn't talk about them as being spoils. I want you to look back with me in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 17. Notice how God defines these things in the city. He said, the city shall be accursed, verse 17. In verse 18 he says, and ye shall in any wise keep yourself from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed when ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble. When God was talking about, and specifically, let's just kind of divide what Achan took here. But when God was talking about the garments that belong to these people, do you know how He described them? They are cursed things. They weren't spoils that were supposed to be divided among the people and taken and kept for themselves. They were things that had a curse upon them, and because they had a curse upon them, they were supposed to be destroyed. So in God's view and in His terms, they were things that were strictly off limits. They were things that were destructive in nature. We might call them nasty things, vile possessions. But they were supposed to be things, when the children of Israel saw them, they were supposed to be things that were devoted for destruction. However, that's not the way that Achan looked at it. And think about that principle as Christians. What leads us to committing sin and being defeated from time to time? Isn't it looking at things differently than the way God looks at them? Isn't it taking things that God has defined as being evil and cursed and destructive in nature and saying these are good and these are pleasurable and these will help me in some way? But when we try to redefine terms that God has already clearly defined in His Word, then that's going to lead us in a direction that is defiant to His will. And one thing that we learn about Satan when we study the Bible, the devil has a way of making things look better than what God says they are. I think Eve is the perfect illustration of that. When you think about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God says to Eve, this is a tree that will cause you to die. After Satan got done talking with Eve in verse 6, she saw it as a tree that had good fruit. She saw it as a tree that was pleasant. The fruit was pleasant to look upon. She saw it as a tree that would make a person wise. And so Satan has this way of taking things that God says are evil and wicked and sinful and destructive and making them look more appealable to than what they actually are. You think about that idea. God clearly said these things have a curse upon them. The second thing that you can take is not everything was cursed. There were some things that were consecrated. In fact, we read back in Joshua 6 and verse 19 where God says, but all the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So you have some things that were cursed. You have other things, when people looked at it, they were supposed to look at it as belonging to God. These were God's possessions. And so God clearly instructed the children of Israel, there are some things in this city that belong to me. They didn't belong, the gold didn't belong to Achan, the silver didn't belong to Israel. Those were things that belonged to God. And they belonged to God and God alone. And when God identifies something or someone as belonging to Him, we don't have any right to try to redefine it as being ours or being anybody else's. You You see, this wasn't Achan's gold or silver, this was God's. And we read about what happens to Achan, and some people say, why was God so severe with Achan? Because the Bible is teaching us that he is robbing God. You know, one thing that I learned, or at least one thing I learned from studying the pages of God's Word, is God is one being. If I were to choose somebody to steal from, God would be at the bottom of my list, wouldn't you? But Achan had stolen something that was consecrated to the Lord. He had taken something that God says, that is mine, it belongs to me, and he had kept it for himself. But why did he do that? Because in his eyes, he had redefined how to look at certain things. You know, the Bible tells us in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20, the conditions of God's people in the Old Testament numerous times were kind of like this. Isaiah shouts a woe there in Isaiah 5 and verse 20, where he says, woe unto them that put darkness for light and light for darkness. And then he talks about how they call good evil and evil good, and they put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. But think about our world today. And I'm not just talking about the secular world that we live in. I'm talking about the religious world. People are literally trying to rewrite God's dictionary, aren't they? They're trying to rewrite things that God has defined as evil and cursed and destructive. They're trying to rewrite them and define them as being good and profitable and helpful and uplifting. But that's the way God's people, or some of God's people, were in the past. They took things that God called good, and they called them evil. They took things that God called evil, and they called them good. They took things that God called darkness and made them into light. And they took things that God called light and made them into darkness. Listen, if God defines terms for us, if he calls something wicked and evil and sinful, that's the end of the debate. Okay, there's no discussion from that point on. And God, the Bible teaches us that God is the only being who has that right to define terms for us. I can't define what is right and wrong in my own opinion. You can't define it for me. I can't define it for you. But God can define it for us. And God can tell us what is right, and he can tell us what is wrong. He can tell us what is good, what is evil, what is righteous, and what is sinful. And so when God clearly defines the terms, we have to be careful that we don't try to redefine them. But unfortunately, that's what leads many people to commit sin today. The third thing that I want us to think about is he coveted worldly things. Notice again what he says in verse 21. He says, when I saw the goodly Babylonian garment and 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight, then I coveted them. That word covet literally means to earnestly desire something. I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of it, but I think we've studied before. It can be used in a positive nature in God's Word, and in fact, most of the time that it's used in the Bible, it is used in a positive nature. There are some things that we should earnestly desire, that we should want, that we should be willing to give up anything and everything for. But there are other things that we shouldn't covet. And namely, there are things that we shouldn't earnestly desire, we shouldn't want, we shouldn't give up everything and anything in order to secure them. But that's what Achan is telling us there. He said, I saw this garment, and I saw that gold, and I saw that silver, and I made up in my mind and in my heart, I'm going to get those things no matter what. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what road it's going to lead me down. I coveted them. I wanted them. I earnestly desired them, and I decided that I was going to take them for myself. Isn't that how sin works, though? You know, when you think about the question, why do we sin? There are some people who like to try to blame God for why we commit certain sins. James had a lot to say about that in James chapter 1, beginning in about verse 13. He says, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. And then in verse 14 he says, but every man is drawn away of his own lusts and enticed. I want you to think about this question. Why did Achan take these garments and take this gold and take this silver? Is it because God made him do it? Is it because God made him want these clothes and want this gold and want this silver? It wasn't God's fault, was it? He wasn't the cause of Achan's sin or even his temptation to sin. But it was Achan himself. It was his desire. When he saw these things, he said, I wanted them. And I decided I was going to get them no matter what the cost was. Instead of being grateful and appreciative for what God was doing for him in the conquering of Jericho, what God was doing for his nation, he was looking at those things and he was imagining in his own heart what it would be like to own those things. You read about the children of Israel, and one of the things that popped into my mind is during that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before they entered into the promised land, they had the same clothes for 40 years, And here Achan sees this robe. He says, boy, I've never seen anything like that. Never had anything that fine before. He said, I wanted something different. But not only that, he never had that much gold and that much silver before. And so he's sitting there looking at it. He's saying, I'd like to own a set of clothes like that. I'd like to have that much gold, and I'd like to have that much silver. And that's why he sinned. And that's why he took those things. Our imagination is the womb from which the desire to sin comes or is born. It's not God. It's what takes place in our minds. And so Achan saw those things, and in his mind, he determined, I've got to have them. I want them. And I'm going to take them whatever the cost be. And that's why he sinned. The Bible teaches us that we have to keep our thinking under control. We have to do some hard things. We have to learn to be content with what we have. Achan had to learn to be content with those 40-year-old clothes that he was still wearing. He had to learn to try to be content with the gold and silver that was his, not as much as what somebody else may have. But that's one of the things that we have to do, curb the desires for something more, for something bigger, for something better. Because when we start coveting worldly things, that's going to lead us into sin, and ultimately sin is going to cause our defeat. The last thing that I want us to think about as to what led Achan to sin and caused his defeat is he thought he could hide it. If you notice in verse 21, that's what he says in the latter part of that verse. He said, when I saw these things, then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are hid in the earth, in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. What does that tell me? That tells me that Achan thought that he could get away with this. And the way that he thought he could get away with taking these clothes and this gold and this silver is to keep it hidden from the sight of everybody else. And so Achan is thinking, if I can just keep it hidden from everybody else, I can get away with this. You think about that in the context of sin, and especially the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, that walked upon this earth. Do you remember what happened when they sinned? The Bible tells us in Genesis 3, verses 8 through 10, that Adam and his wife hid themselves. God comes looking for them, and he's calling for Adam. He said, where are you, Adam? I can't find you. And in verse 10 of Genesis 3, Adam says, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, and because I was naked, I hid myself. How'd that work out for Adam and Eve? See, Adam and Eve thought we can hide and get away with this, right? But what we learn from that story is the Lord discovered them. They couldn't hide it from God that they had sinned. Achan couldn't hide it from God that he'd taken this garment and he'd taken this gold and this silver. And friends, there's nothing we can hide from God either. We might try it, and we might think we can get away with it, but the reality of the situation is God is going to discover it. In fact, Moses makes a statement in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 32 and verse 23. He's actually talking about the 2.5 tribes of Israel. Remember, they wanted the land on the east side of the Jordan. And the children of Israel that conquered that land, they were getting ready to go into the promised land. And Moses asked God, and God says, you tell them they can have it, but they've got to go and finish conquering the promised land first. And after everything's done, then they can go back and they can have this land, and I won't hold anything against them. But in verse 23, here's what he says. But if you will not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord. and be sure your sin will find you out. I think about that statement there and the particular words that are used within the context of what was spoken. There's one word that really stands out to me more than any other. Sure. Be sure your sin will find you out. It wasn't a question of if. It wasn't a question of maybe, maybe not. It is without a doubt going to come to light. And whether you think about sin in today's world too, why do sometimes we as Christians commit sin? Because we think we can get away with it. Because we think we can keep it hidden from everybody else, and we think as long as it's hidden from everybody else, everything's going to be all right. Be sure your sin will find you out. If it doesn't find you out in this life, I guarantee you it will find you out in the next. But how foolish is it to think that God can't see what we're doing, or that we can hide something from God? I always think about the picture of children playing hide and seek. You probably remember as a child yourself, or you've probably seen it sometime in this world. You know what we think as children? That as long as we can't see you, you can't see us. And so we'll stand behind a tree that's this big around and put it between us and you, and we think you can't see me. We'll put a cover over our head and think nobody knows where I am. They can't see me. Think about it. That's the way God views us when we're trying to hide something from Him. In fact, the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews 4:13, he said, "Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him, with whom we must do," the King James Version says, "to whom we must give an account." Even if we managed our entire life to hide some sin that we had committed from everybody else in this world, what good is that going to do us in the end? What's it going to accomplish for us? God knows and God sees. And I might go my entire life and I might keep a sin hidden from you and from everybody else, but in the end, what good is that going to do me? God sees it all. And God knows it all. And we're going to give an account to the one who sees and knows everything. I think about Achan's sin and how egregious it becomes, more egregious, when you consider all the good things that God had done for him. Think about every good thing that God had done for him and his family for the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Think of the good thing that God had done for them in parting the Jordan, or stopping the Jordan and allow them to walk over on dry land. Think about the good things that God had done for them in the conquering of the city of Jericho. He had all these wonderful blessings and privileges that God poured out upon him, but he disobeyed God anyway. And this is the kicker for me, and really it's the kicker for hidden sin in general. He did it to take something or to get something that he couldn't really enjoy anyway. You ever think about that? What would he have done with that Babylonian garment? I mean, was he going to put it on and walk around, the camp of Israel, and everybody starts saying, wait a minute, where'd you get that thing? Then what was he going to do with all that gold and silver? You go out and you start spending lavishly and buying all these things, aren't people going to start scratching their heads saying, now how did he get all this money? The only thing that he could do is hide it in the earth. So he took something that he really couldn't enjoy in the first place. And that's the way hidden sin is. Listen, if you got to hide it, can you really enjoy it anyway? That was the first defeat of God's people in the land of Canaan. But it wouldn't be their last. And what we learn through this story is what led to their defeat. And the answer is sin. Sin will lead to our defeat too. What is it that caused Achan to sin? What is it that caused him to be defeated? It was the second look. It was the one where you start making plans and where the imagination of man starts thinking about what he needs and how he can accomplish it. It was trying to look at things differently than how God looked at him. Taking things that God called cursed or solely belonging to him and saying, those things aren't really that bad, or those things belong to me and they belong to other people too. It's the idea of coveting after worldly things. about setting your heart, your desire on something that's worldly in nature and saying, I want it, I got to have it, I don't care what the cost is going to be. And then the last thing we talked about is thinking that you can hide it and get away with it. Those are the things that led to his defeat, and they're the same thing that leads to God's people's defeat today. We need to study this chapter, read it, meditate upon it, listen to it, learn it, and heed the things that are written therein. Maybe there's one